Breacher Squads. Story continued from Legion Warrior Lodges. The date was set, the plans drawn, the die cast. And in the next few days, Tarax Antarax, the Cudgel, Hexamon, the Oathkeeper, and Ulik, the Unreasonable, were seen at the front. Practically under the noses of the Xenos defenses, they would creep through the siege emplacements, going down through the tunnels and trenches. Each day, they took weapons of ancient design to within spitting distance of the walls, and each day they would come back with their results. They had a mere 3 days to prepare for the event, but on the third morning, they had found their answer. As always, Tarax would pop his head over the trench edge and take one shot from his weapon of the day. He trusted none of his subordinates to do this. It was so very personal, because, for the first time in a long time, Tarax was having fun. As he ducked down under cover again, the next face to come up would be that of Hexamon and some of his men. They would snipe out anyone firing down on Tarax's position with ruthless efficiency. Just outside of the automated defensive gun's range, only other snipers could possibly hit them. Yet the Emperor's children took at least one of the defenders, often more, whenever they popped their heads over. Such brutal accuracy that even an Imperial fist would nod in approval. And while this all went on, Ulik would pop up and fire his own weapon of choice. They would do this for a few rounds, repositioning, then firing, then ducking once more. And the harmony between them was a thing to behold. Their drill masters would have shed a tear, their upper officers looked on in horror. For this was the first time that any had witnessed these 3 men working with anyone else in such accord. And on that third day, they had an answer. They were followed by only a pair of their honor guard for speed of movement. As they met up on that third day, walking through the mud back to the HQ, they traded information. Ulik the Unreasonable bit off. "Are we there yet, Tarax?" "We better be. Tomorrow we attack," stated Hexamon, thumping Tarax on his shoulder pauldron in a totally uncharacteristic display of bonhomie. Tarax then threw back his head and laughed. "Ha ha ha ha! Oh yeah. I have the measure of their defenses. I know what that shield does now." Ulik then barked. "Then you know how to take it down? Good. We are on track." The 3 leered at each other. Their vile plan was about to be realized. It was winter. The target city was in the northern hemisphere, and the dusk was swift and complete. Like a dark satin cloth being dropped over the world, there was now total darkness. The defenders had long ago learnt that to use light was to invite the pinpoint accuracy of the Emperor's children, and the camp of the besieged Marines was rigidly disciplined. No light shone to give away their positions. In fact, the defenders would never understand the depths of their danger. For the Iron Warriors had begun this siege. The alien defenders had powerful energy weaponry, fields as strong as void shields, protected anywhere of worth. The smaller the area protected, the more powerful the effect. Yet, the Xenos had lost 3 cities of smaller scale to the invading Iron Warriors in rapid succession. As stated, they had begun this siege, so everything was underground. Everything. Burrowing with the support of the Mechanicum, they had not even entered the valley, never showed themselves on the plains, had begun their tunnels on the other side of a range of hills. They were large, but not dense. Hence, the Iron Warriors had wormed their way across the plains, always digging lower on one side than that facing the citadel. They could all walk unobstructed and practically open on one side, utterly out of sight to their foes still. The enemy had only known they were present when they came out to scout. Trapdoors and hidden trenches, all dug out so as to not even appear to the defenders, as they were dug out from below. And the Xenos who came out far enough were dragged under, shot from below, or simply fell into trench works and were torn to pieces by the Astartes hidden there. The digging had continued, yet when they had reached a certain point, the Iron Warriors had thrown everything they had at the gates. They appeared out of hidden holes all across the valley, coming out in near total surprise on one terrible dawn. Yet, despite the surprise, the defences of the Xenos had held. Their automated turrets had activated and culled the sons of Perturabo before they had even taken a dozen paces. These turrets were soon shot out, but the defenders on the walls now shot down into the oncoming Iron Warriors and scythed through them. A direct assault was not possible. Not with the resources in place. So, the Iron Warriors had called for assistance. And it is to this seeming backwater, yet vitally important planet, that the 3 officers had been sent to resolve the issue. Tarax Antarax had reviewed the doctrines in place, the strategy and tactics used thus far. He did not even finish his review before he summoned the officer in charge. The doors opened, and the officer walked in. The doors opened again, and his guards dragged out the now headless man. His cranium a messy pulp. The cudgel did not restrain himself when he knew that he was right. Offensive operations were instantly put on hold, the only activity being deeply unpleasant attacks during the night. Never full-on assaults, but rad grenade launchers, toxic gas assaults. The enemy would never make out those who attacked them. They would never understand how some of their people had died until it was an entire section. Yet still, Antarax did not order a full attack. His time with the Night Lords had certainly done its job. For the Xenos must have been quailing now. Not because they had suffered, but because they could never see or revenge themselves on said attackers. Ghosts. The defenders would believe they were fighting ghosts. Yet all of this was a ruse, of course. There would be a full-scale assault, but the cudgel never messed around. He only launched an assault for one of 3 reasons. 1. To keep the enemy tired, bedraggled. For few beings had the stamina of an Astartes, so these battles of endurance were always one-sided. 2. To remove an annoying subordinate that had transferred from fleet. It was rare, but occasionally some bright rising star would be fed to Anthrax. And 3. To end the matter in one hammer blow, one swing of the proverbial cudgel. And the first 2 were exceptional rarities. When Tarax struck, he dealt a coup de grace. He ended his enemy. Digging had continued, as something special had been agreed before he had even landed. The previous commander was not a total incompetent, it now seemed. Entire segments were for the siege ordinators that Upper Command had requested. Tarax, Hexamon and Ulluk were present when it was discovered. The 3 had grinned at each other when they had heard. Gaining ordinatus was practically unheard of in some areas, rarest of the rare as the crusade came out far enough. Their lines of supply stretched to near exhaustion, and the regional forge worlds oft recovering from being brought back into compliance. But when one had them attached to your fleet, your section, it was far, far easier to keep them than gain them. The 3 had plans that made their use derelict, yet the opportunity was all. And both Ulluk and Hexamon had thrown aside their claim. Strangely, the 3 had been utterly candid with each other, something most despised them for, if truth be told. But when these men spoke more and more openly as they mingled, they found true kinship. In such a short time, they were even finishing each other's sentences when pauses permitted, if not outright invited this. And in that room, when they first met, they recognized something. They had absolutely zero competition with one another. And from that day, their discussions had been incredible, harmonic. For Hexamon was a drop specialist, Ulluk an all-rounder. Neither needed the Ordinatus, the heaviest bombardment cannons the Imperium commanded. But usually, a Marine officer could be guilty of greed in only one situation: war gear. When it was offered, available, none turned it down. Many harbored it just for its utility. So most would have at least tried to gain a slither for their own forces, but not this time. They would give it all to Tarax. And when Hexamon declared what he required from the campaign, the other 2 men nodded in appreciation. Of something worthy of having, yet something they would never acquire nor want, yet still honoured the wish. Ulluk had his goals also, but again, neither of his allies balked. In fact, they agreed to most things, and that terrified all around them. Their respect was mirrored, the dark as night humour exchanged. A woe for the galaxy and its future became stronger with every second they were together. Ulluk had chosen his line breacher squads to take the first wave, for if anyone could weather the initial defensive fire, it was the Death Guard. And Ulluk would be right behind the prime squads, the forlorn hope, the first to rise from the trenches and make the mad dash towards any hole in the walls. He prepared his breacher squads, as they would be best placed to take the frontal charge, nor would any of them refuse the honour. Many would see it as a chance at glory. Others would see it as a chance to be free of their terrible burden. It was not pleasant being a breacher under the command of the unreasonable one. Yet, as unreasonable as he was, he could, at times, be fair. Harsh, but fair. If they survived, they would be transferred to another unit, another role. Ulluk rotated his men regularly. Some said to give them false hope, but this was gallows humour more often than not. They were Death Guard, They endured as well as the Iron Warriors. And high above, Hexamon had now transferred back up to his strike cruiser. The drop pod assault would fall fast, but all was now in place. All was ready. For Tarax Antarax had found the type of field protecting the city, the makeup of the nut, so he had exactly the right nutcracker in place. When dusk finally swept down, it began. Ulik and Tarax stood together in a trench, all at their order. They both looked at their chronometric readings on their heads-up displays, nodded to one another, then barked the same simple order. Begin! Hidden trapdoors swung down, and hundreds of Marines charged up them onto the muddy ground toward the walls. Tarax now watched his display as he saw the same information being fed to Ulik. The Death Guard were pushing forward, but many of the chevrons were disappearing, becoming dormant as their corresponding Marine lived no more. The casualties were easily half of that which had been offered up in the Iron Warriors' assault before the Trinity had taken over. Breacher shields held high, the defenders had to concentrate rapid fire down on one until they simply burnt from being superheated. They were dying, but they were getting closer. So much so that they had overshot expectations. Tarax then chuckled as he looked at Ulik and said, "Some of your men are now in the way." A snort issued from Ulik as he spat. "My men are here, behind and around me," indicating his honor guard. "Those are just names on a casualty report. Statistics. Let her rip." And all could hear the tension in his lips, how they must now be twisting into a smile. "Heh," echoed Tarax, as he then gave the one sigil order to fire and said quietly, "There she blows. The bodies will give power to the shot." With that, a light came streaking across the skies. From an impossible distance, calculated perfectly. It had followed the curve of the planet itself, and it slammed into the region like a spear of sunlight. A heavy conversion beamer. Yet when it hit the walls, it ate everything before it, everything out in no man's land for a dozen paces on either side of its progress, including the Marines over which it sailed, so seemingly high above their heads. For the blast was actually a field of power that converted all before it, all that it struck, antimatter. And as it passed over the Marines, it gained in power. It slammed into the walls of the Xenos city. It did not smash them or blast them. It changed them into energy. The wake of the weapon simply unmade everything before it. Then, at its most powerful, it struck the wall fully, eating the exterior, absorbing the shields, adding to its power, until finally it then gave a secondary explosive sound as all of the accumulated and converted matter now erupted forward as the field was broken, finally having changed all that it could. And the power therein contained smashed down the walls of the citadel like they were made of sugar or salt. Where any other attack had been absorbed into the shields of the enemy, this weapon had converted the force fields into power and turned it on its users. These weapons were rare, even during the Crusade, so Antarax had to be sure before deploying them. But in the game of rock, paper, scissors, this had been the paper to the defence's rock. And there was now a gap in the curtain wall, 20 paces wide. The Death Guard shifted their charge and accumulated at the open segment and went in hard. their breacher shields protecting them from much of the enemy fire, but not all. Many died, but still fewer than there should have been. The Death Guard simply moved forward, shrugging off hits that would have floored or outright slain other Marines. And amongst the breacher front lines soon appeared the destroyer units, backing them up. The breachers locked their shields as they now advanced into the alien city, covering for the oncoming destroyers. Behind them was Ulik and his honor guard, and right behind them were the Iron Warriors, headed by Tarax and Tarax. And it went like clockwork. Ulik taking his men into the city, pushing forward endlessly, taking fire and attention wherever they could. All while Tarax and Tarax led his men in one hard push toward a building that seemed to be only moderately defended. Yet it was strategically important. Very. For Tarax had studied these Xenos, had discussed them with Hexamon as well, and both were now almost certain that they knew the best way to take down the Xenos power grid in a very specific region, with the destruction of just one building. Hence Tarax and his men came to it, then set up heavy weapons, and brought this innocuous fortification down in just 3 volleys. It was not just the power of the melters and las cannons that they had brought, the many crack missiles that soared through the air. It was the accuracy as well, the precision. Not the impossible shots of the Emperor's children or the Imperial fists, but fire solutions made via experience. For the Iron Warriors knew one segment of war above near all others: how to take down fortifications, and they brought down the building in seconds, and not a moment too soon. For as it all came crashing down, the shielding over the city, that separate defense that protected them from above, a segment of it went down. Not everywhere, as was soon apparent, but in one tight section of only 100 meters around, and in less than 3 seconds, the drop pods of the Emperor's children came through the hole in the grid, aiming directly at the center spire of the defenders, their capital building. The men of both Death Guard and Iron Warriors marveled. As the fire-encased drop pods crashed through and smashed directly on target, purple-clad Marines charged out into the very center of the spire, among the ruining cast of the Xenos. One of Tarax's men balked and just looked at him. "What would be if we were only a few seconds late?" And Tarax snorted. "They would all be dead to a man." The level of trust for this little venture to work as it did was not lost on anyone who participated in it. The next hour found the enemy falling back again and again under the brutal trudge of the Death Guard and Iron Warriors. Yet the automatic turrets were all down. The city's only defense, its lackluster soldiers. They were armed well, but had no experience, nor were they a match for the Astartes, so they died swiftly. Yet still, it took time to get to the central point. And when Ulik and Tarax finally took the last thoroughfares into the square before the Spire of Command, they witnessed the triumphant departure of Hexamon the Oathkeeper. He had made an oath of moment that he would take this position with only half a company of men, and in half the time it should, by the strictures of the Principia Bellicosa, and by all realistic projections. Yet, when Ulik and Tarax looked on as he slowly walked down the remains of the majestic stairs to this civilization's highest holy place, he had but a fraction of the men he took in. The losses were extreme, but the deed had been impossible. And yet, neither the Death Guard nor the Iron Warrior looked on in anything but cheerful acceptance. They had not doubted him for a minute, not a second. So unlikely a trio. Everything logical, Every rule of the universe and the human condition stated that they should have despised one another. Yet now, together, they had pulled off a victory so swift, so total, that it could not be kept out of the annals of the legions. Somehow, the three had become greater than the sum of their parts. A combination, a cocktail, a realization that hundreds of Marines and millions upon millions of mortal humans, almost without count, would come to deeply regret. It was only a few short years until they all met again, on the darkest day of the fledgling Imperium, in year 006, Millennium 31, when all was turned upside down in the Urgal Depression of Istvan V. To be continued. Welcome, gentle listener. I am Voldemort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and features of the 30K universe and the Horus Heresy, where the age of knowledge and enlightenment has ended, and the age of darkness has begun. And today, we are to discuss the first line of warriors that is often glimpsed by the enemy of the Legio Astartes, the Space Marines. Breacher units are some of the boldest and bravest of the entire Legion, for they are the first into the most dangerous situations, the most high casualty scenarios. In essence, the first charge. Now one might think that the blitzkrieg tactics of the Marines makes the drop pod assault and the jump pack descent to be the most high-octane and dangerous methods of attack. But when these units land, they have a lot of flexibility in their movement for jump pack units, and the shock and awe of a drop pod assault gives its own protection of assault. For when the drop pods come down, there are not languid hours of warning as they descend. It is minutes or even seconds, and when the pods hit down, they crash through buildings, smash through defenses. They have explosive charges on the inside to force the doors down in mere moments, in seconds. All of this makes them unpredictable, loud, terrifying, and, ultimately, a shock to the system that leaves most defending forces in massed confusion. The pod itself is high in the sky 1 second, smashing into the ground and forcing all to their knees with a mere shock and boom of the strike. Then, in less than 2 seconds, the doors are down, and walking tanks are diving from the pod, gunning down all in their path. The armor and accuracy, speed and ferocity of the Marines that come out is staggering. Few forces can even contemplate holding against such a shock assault, but the breacher's role is utterly different. For they are used in siege warfare, as I have tried to highlight in my little tale at the start, or they are used in boarding actions. Ship-to-ship warfare in the grim darkness of the far future is terrifying to all involved. The boarding pods are usually the main way to assault, and is not that different to the way I have described the drop pod attack. But in these larger events, then ships can be sent over, carrying a score of Marines or more each. The pods land an advanced force who would often try to neutralize the defending ship's defense batteries, then take the hangars. From there, the breachers could be brought across en masse. For taking a ship in the 40K universe, or more importantly, the 30K universe, is like to invading a small city. One with corridors and choke points aplenty. It is the scale involved. For many a vessel runs into miles of corridors, miles of space to be taken, and hundreds, if not many thousands of denizens who call it not only their ship, but their home. And they will defend it like cornered mad dogs, because there is no retreat from their vessel. There is victory or there is death. So even the menials, the normal men and women who make the ship go, will charge into battle in rabid frenzies brought about by fear and desperation. The defenders will often have automated systems, the knowledge of the layout of the ship, its many thoroughfares, its many nuances. They will set trap after trap. A normal naval boarding action will lead to thousands of dead on the side of the attacker. But for the Marines, this is normal fare. But it is no less dangerous. The breachers are the ones who are thrust to the front of these corridor battles, these horrific traps. The enemy may be desperate and scared, but they will often be prepared and dug in. Unlike the drop pod assault, where confusion kills as many defenders, the static defences of the naval vessel, or the even worse situation, the besieged warriors holding a terrestrial setting, will all be prepared. They will be waiting for the first thing to hove into view, to take one step into their alley of carnage, and they will attempt to obliterate anything they see in front of them, often with heavy weapons in situ. And it is to these nightmares that the breacher units will have to charge. Now the breachers were well equipped indeed, for they would be assigned heavy power armor, usually derivations of the Mark III power armor, specifically designed to give them much more protection than previous or even successive patterns. In the old lore, the Mark III was developed due to the conflict with the Squats, what are now dubbed the kin of the leagues of Votan. Tunnel fighting was key, as the Scots held their delved bases with a fury to match the Marines. Thus, the front plating of the Mark III is incredibly dense. On top of this, the breachers will most often have a huge ablative shield, by which to attempt to defray just some of the firepower coming in at them. They would be able to lock their shields at intersections and bring up their own heavy firepower, only breaking their shield wall to get out of the way as their own fire then destroyed hardpoints. But most often, it was one Marine at the front taking everything the entrenched enemy could dish out to them. So it was purely down to who had the better equipment and skill. For if their weaponry was enough, could punch through the shield and Mark III armor of the breacher, then the assaulting Marines would just have to eat the casualties and attempt to charge over the bodies of those who had come before, attempting to gain enough ground with each dead Marine to finally allow them to hit the defences. But if the shots from the opposition could not penetrate the shield, let alone the armour, then the one Marine would simply charge the line and smash through it, leading other breachers, then destroyers or assault units in their wake, to expand out and slaughter all they encountered. But it was always a huge risk to the breacher, for one cannot make use of the agility and speed of the Astartes when surrounded by deep confined corridors. All they had was the will and armour to get them to their location. Then, and only then, could they exact their vengeance on the foe. The accuracy of the Marine, the cold discipline, would allow them to do far better than a simple slab shield-wielding Ogrin, though. For a bolter is a terrible weapon, and the breacher shields were designed for the use of the bolter as they advanced, so they were able to keep heads down or take them off when advancing, making the breacher a nasty unit to face in nearly every regard. But, as with many things from the Great Crusade, the use of breachers died after that period. For the tactical dreadnought armour, the Terminator suit was developed to replace the breacher, and it was by far more flexible due to the teleportation ability, and far more rugged, being almost impenetrable in most scenarios. Nor were breachers used even in the absence of Terminators, for the nature of the Marines had changed. They were no longer the Legio Astartes. They were no longer an attacking force, a dominating army, a crusade of expansion. They had been transformed into a defensive reactionary force, and the scale of warfare had also changed. People forget that sometimes. The Crusade had exterminated most races and the vast majority of threats in the Milky Way galaxy. The Orcs were nearly everywhere, and they still are, but their largest empire, the one that could have coalesced support, was gone. The Alanor campaign put pay to that last standout. The Eldar were powerful, but of such few numbers that they were almost insignificant on the grander scale. All due to their own ennui, or boredom, if truth be told. The Necrons had not arisen, the bugs had not arrived, the Tau were still dwelling in mud huts. There was simply no need for the huge armies of the Crusade any longer, and with the annihilation meted out during the heresy, there was no longer the numbers of Marines to perform those ways of war. The Marines would now be the elite, not the line troopers that they had been during the Crusade. They would be called in when absolutely needed, or not at all. It would be the Guard, the Astra Militarum, that now performed the sieges, the high attrition battles. The Marines would be the decapitating strike, or the strategic specialists. Hence the use of breachers was simply not required, and simply not possible anymore. And of course, the Marines now had Terminator armor. They could teleport behind the defensive lines of the enemy, could weather twice or thrice the firepower the breacher could. Hence, the breacher squads died with the heresy. But I do wonder, for again, the galaxy has changed. After 10,000 years, the landscape of the universe is even more dark. For the bugs do exist, and have arrived. The Necrons have awoken, and the Tau are now a threat, even if only locally. And the bug ships, or those of the Necrons, will need to be boarded in numbers not seen since the Crusade. The forces of chaos take cities, worlds, sectors, in their endless march from the Great Tear across the galaxy. And the Imperium will need to root out their defenses, will need to take their bastions, for inside them, dark incantations are performed that can affect entire regions around, with the increased need for punishing assaults and the existence of the Marines in numbers not seen since the Crusade, due to Belisarius Cawl and the Primaris. And lastly, the penchant of the Lord Defender, Reboot Guilliman, returning to structures and formations not seen since the heresy. There is every chance we could see their return. For the Primaris Marines have their own shields, as seen in the Blade Guard veterans. So perhaps, just perhaps, in the near future, we shall see Primaris breacher units. Wouldn't that be fun? I have been Voldemort, your faithful servant. Please be aware that we also have a natural history channel and a brand new mythology channel. Both are in their infancy, but we hope you can see their potential if you give them a chance. Links in the description. Thank you for your precious time. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.